everybody. Welcome to ABA Inside Track, the podcast that's like reading in your car, but safer. I'm your host, Robert Perry Cruz, and with me, as always, are my fabulous co-hosts. Fabulous co-hosts.
You didn't give me a chance to respond in between.
I'm mass trialing my introduction, Diana. Go. Oh, I just said your name. I ruined
Diana.
It was a prompt. Let's do it again. Fabulous co-host.
Hey, Rob, it's Diana.
There we go. We got it right that time. You did it independent and mastery.
That's how you do it.
Wait, how about me? I'm Jackie. I got it correct, unprompted,
Good job.
and independent. So give me all.
Hey, Jackie, what's that behind you?
It's a cat.
What's this?
It's imaginary.
What's this?
It's Seltzer.
Fabulous co-host.
Jackie.
There we go. See, that's another example of one way you could introduce someone if they don't remember how to be introduced on a podcast.
I like this. I was like,
I got to run these bits by you guys before I just throw them out there.
It's not a real cat.
It is disconcerting when someone says, "What's that behind you?"
No
matter what it is.
As I'm slow, it's like,
suddenly you're like, "What is behind me?"
Is it a plasma monster?
Right?
It's not a plasma monster.
Nope.
Like, are you ever like washing your face at the sink, and all of a sudden you're like, "I'm gonna look up in the mirror, and there's gonna be something there behind me."
Yep.
This-
Every morning.
Did you guys see the American remake of The Ring, directed by Gore Verbinski?
Yes.
So there's a great scene at the beginning of the movie where you know something creepy is going on. They've sort of talked about the idea of like you watch this video and then you die. And you know the girl who is, I think it's Amber Tamblyn from Joan of Arcadia, is one of the girls, and she's walking into the kitchen to get a snack. And she opens the refrigerator, the top half of the refrigerator.
No.
And you're sitting there going, oh, she's going to close the refrigerator. There's a monster. She's going to close the refrigerator, a monster. And then she closes the refrigerator. There's nothing there.
Of course there's not, because now you're waiting for it to come out somewhere else.
But that's one of the earlier examples, I think, of the whole, everybody knows what's going to happen in a scary movie. So if it doesn't happen, it'll be scarier.
Even creepier.
That's great. The Ring remake, I feel, is a good horror movie. I feel a bit underrated. But, you know, this podcast isn't about good timing where you're opening podcast bits, nor is it about horror movies. It is, in fact, about behavior analysis and behavior analytic research. Every week on ABA Inside Track, we pick a topic and then we discuss some of the recent research about it to give you, the behavior analyst at home, a little bit more fun information about our science. This week, we are going to be talking about discrete trial types, or as I like to call it, masked trials versus everybody. Not specifically because of any sort of bias about mass trials, but because mass trials is going to be a feature in every article we discuss this week.
Mass trials against the world.
Masked trials against the world.
MT.
That's right. And this is a topic which, like most good topics in science and research, really came from a place of revenge and competitiveness. As we all know, that is the best way for science to be developed. No, this is
to have it published quickly.
It's slightly true. So I'm going to go in the Wayback Machine. It was years and years ago. And I had a colleague at the time who was really, really gung-ho about interspersal. And we really weren't set up to do interspersal. Like, we trained all of our staff to do more what you'd consider, and many of these articles would consider, mass trials. And I did what I think any good behavior analyst should do and said, whoa. Why would we switch to interspersal? Is there actually research to show that there's a benefit to using interspersed trials versus mass trials versus any other type of trials? And I said, you know what I'll do? I'm going to look at the research. Not only because I wanted to know the answer, but because I was really, really hoping I was right so that I could shove it in their face. Because we were having a bit of a, not a kerfuffle, but you know, when you have those like professional kind of, you just want to be righter more than the other person. So I went to the trouble of looking up a lot of research on
discourse,
masked trials, and whether they were better or worse than other types of trials. And I found some of the articles we'll be discussing today, not all of them, I think, but most of them. And I was able to make a case that, you know what? We need to slow our rolls and do a little research first, which is important. We should always base our practice in scientific evidence. And if being ethical also dovetails with kind of being a self-centered competitive jerk, you know, hey, you know, who's to say that's not okay, right? Maybe the ethics board, but I say it's great. So that is the genesis of tonight's episode. We're going to talk about a topic that I found very interesting for good reasons and also for evil reasons. So if you don't want to listen,
say you're evil, Rob, but I do think this is kind of like a hot button topic, right? Because a lot of people are
because
invested.
It is a topic that made me very mad in the past. I know, Diana, you're right. Thank you for confirming my point.
It is. It's something
true.
people are interested in.
Yep.
Right?
And if you do one or the other, you're stuck with it. You like it, right? You're not. I've seen it anyway. If someone does one thing, right, they love mass trials, they're less hesitant to do anything else.
They're more hesitant.
Yes, that's what I meant.
Yeah. I've done both, and I'm going to tell you guys my story later on.
Oh, you're saving it for later?
Just waiting for Rob to, finish the intro.
Oh, is it as much of a story of revenge, like a Count of Monte Cristo-esque revenge story, as mine is? An epic 1,000-page tale?
Monte Cristo. Nom, nom, nom.
I don't know.
I love that Jackie's like, don't understand the sandwich or the literary reference. Really sorry.
Or the Simpsons reference.
Or the
piled on
Simpsons
top.
reference.
Rob, what articles are we reading today?
Well, we'll be reading 3 trials. 3 trials. I've got trials on the brain, folks. We'll be reading 3 articles all about mass trials versus the world. And again, not to say that mass trials are the superior trials or anything. Please don't read into it. It's just the trial type that was in every single one of these articles.
But do read the articles.
So we're going to be reading 3 articles. The first one we'll be discussing is comparing the effects of massed and distributed practice on skill acquisition for children with autism by Hawk, Kodak, Kurtz Nelson, Porritt, Rush, and Caravo from the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis, 2015. We'll also be reading Comparing Massed Trial Instruction, Distributed Trial Instruction, and Task Interspersal to Teach TAKS to Children with Autism Spectrum Disorders by Majladani, Wilder, Grief, Mathewson, and Saini from the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis, 2014. And Teaching with Massed versus Interspersed Trials, Effects on Acquisition, Maintenance, and Problem Behavior by Henriksen, Rapp, and Ashbeck from Behavioral Interventions, 2015. So, let's get underway, shall we? First, why don't we lay a couple ground rules, some definitions. What are we talking about? What are we talking about when we talk about massed trials or distributed trials or interspersed trials? Because while I think we probably all as behavior analysts have like a generally common vocabulary, I would not be surprised if my exact definition of what I think of as a massed or distributed trial is not quite the same as another individual's, unless we've all read the same research. And again, since I think one of the first things you probably learn as a behavior analyst, especially if you're working with children with autism or students with autism, you learn how to do discrete trials, which means you're learning how to do one of these trial types. And the place you work, like you were saying, Jackie, is the place that trained you how to do them. And you probably didn't think too much on it because it was, like the first or second skill you learned how to do. And it was only years and years later that you ever said, hey, that thing I learned to do when I first started in this field, why the hell did I do it that way? Why didn't I do it a different way?
Amen to that.
You did what you were told.
Because you did what you were told.
Well, you think that you might think that you asked an easy question when you just asked that question, but I don't think that the answer is actually as straightforward as you might think. So first, let's take mass trials.
Trials done in Massachusetts.
Exactly. The only type of trials. Go Red Sox. No, just kidding. Well, actually, I want to back up and before that state that everything that we're going to talk about in both of these categories is discrete trial training, right? So definition is not exclusionary to the massed trial category. So whenever you're running discrete trial training, you're presenting an SD, you're prompting a response where you get an unprompted response, and you reinforce that response. Typically, in most places, in most fashion, you're going to run several of those trials in a row, right? In order to create the opportunity for responding underneath that context of reinforcement and thereby promoting acquisition. However, the massed component where you're running like 5 or 9 or 10 trials in a row isn't inherent to discrete trial training. It's how we often do it, but it's not how it has to necessarily be done. So that brings in the flip side of saying, well, maybe we could run things as interspersed or distributed trials instead. There's been some literature on this, some of which we're going to review, but not all, because there's actually a fair amount of sort of scattered literature on this. And part of the problem when you start to delve into this literature is that not everyone has defined interspersed or distributed in the same way. Everyone said, I think it should probably best be done this way, and it might be totally different than how some other researchers do it, which, as we also know, just because someone did it in research, there's probably like 20 different permutations out there that haven't been done in research as well. So there are many different definitions of what some people call distributed or interspersed trials. For the one that I'm going to talk about, they looked at distribution across days of the week running trials versus massing all of the trials for the week in one day. So that's like one interpretation. The Majdalani article also compared running trials every 1 to 2 seconds, which was like really short ITI, with running trials every 10 seconds, which is only a slightly longer ITI, right? But that was like the comparison point there. Charlotte and colleagues in 92 looked at interspersing maintenance trials with acquisition trials and calling that trial interspersal. Grow and colleagues looked at doing varying types of acquisition tasks only and interspersing those. And the list goes on. So there are many different interpretations of what interspersed or distributed trials might mean.
True.
Which unfortunately kind of muddies the water when we start to talk about whether this is an effective strategy as compared to mass trials, because there's just a lot of different factors that are being thrown around in there. The other point that I think is important to make, and this is related to this but isn't the only point to take away here, is that I have found that it's common when we start working with a new client that we meet them and we say, okay, we're going to go in, we're going to do DTT, we're going to do 5, 9, or 10 trials in a row. Right. And that's the programming for this client. But I would like to make the argument and have people think about that type of mass DTT trial is really the most restrictive approach to skill acquisition. Right. And there may be less restrictive approaches to skill acquisition that could still produce high levels of new behavior that we'd like to see maintain and generalize in other settings. Right. And it's possible that some of the research in this trial interspersal arena has come about because people are looking at potentially less restrictive ways of providing instruction.
Sure.
Right.
And maybe easier.
Possibly
for staff,
easier.
Potentially.
Possible. Although I don't know. I think I think it's harder, but that may be a little bit more naturalistic and may lend themselves better toward generalization as well. Right? So although the research in this area is scattered, I think it's coming from an important place in that we're thinking about how can we best apply our science in a way that's going to be most beneficial for the client versus just immediately going to mass DTT.
Right. Yep. I agree with you. And looking at efficiency and effectiveness as well.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right.
And that's the question. Like, we still don't really know what's better if we do interspersal, whatever that might mean, right? Versus mass trials. Are you going to get quicker acquisition? Are you going to get better maintenance or generalization over time? Or the other important point that I think sometimes people want to explore is, might running interspersed trials produce lower rates of challenging behavior, right? So kind of an EO modification there, which are all really important points that have been related to this literature.
Sure.
Yeah.
Spoiler, mine looked at that. Spoiler.
I think we're also looking too at a specific sort of population with a perceived need. So specifically children with autism who are not developing certain skills as quickly as age-matched peers, who we are trying to continue to work on the efficiency of learning procedures to make up for any delays. So efficiency here is learn the most, learn it the fastest, and maintain it for as long as possible. Whereas, like you said, Diana, there are other pieces that are going to go into any programming. It's not just about always, you need to learn 100 tacks in a short amount of time as possible. It may be, you need to learn 100 tacks at some point, but we're using a different schedule of reinforcement where learning the most in the shortest amount of time isn't the only goal. Like maybe it is more about maintaining longer and longer periods free of self-injury or free of aggression when presented with some of these tasks. So there are a lot of targets that need to be discussed in terms of planning. And we also are not talking about best practice learning for everybody, because again, we're only talking about the participants in the study, which really fall into that category. And I think even in the Majdalani article, there's a reference to sort of Sundberg and sort of his work on the VB map, talking about how a lot of times interspersal is great when you're looking at students who are scoring higher on a VB map, because that's often more how a lot of other learners are taught. You know, we learn a couple things and people say some other things unrelated to what we're talking about, but tangentially related. So we learn a different fact or a different verbal operant in the way they're presenting that material. We're not really speaking about that type of learning. Even there, I think there's room for growth as to what's the most efficient way to teach a neurotypical student how to do their math facts. Our mass trials might actually still be considered the best for those students, but maybe they're not. That's typically not how we teach students in, say, like a public school setting or the typical public school setting. But you're going to see different teaching styles. If you're using like direct instruction, where there is more of that, not exactly mass trial, but somewhat like small interspersal.
Opportunity for response.
Yeah. So again, we're talking about something very specific here. The conversation, of course, would go way beyond that, but we've only got so much time and we've only got so many articles. So just lots to think about, but we're going to stay a little bit hyper-focused and kind of stay in our episode lane when it comes to this topic.
Okay. So I reviewed the Hawk and colleagues article from 2015, which was comparing the effects of massed and distributed practice on skill acquisition for children with autism. And my study is the odd man out of our studies. So you can, you can think about that as you're listening.
Aren't you our odd man out?
And just imagine, am I?
No, you're not. I am, because I'm not married to you.
You have a different last name, so yeah.
Rob's the boy.
That's true.
We all have an odd man out.
Which one of these is not like the others?
The two of you. Okay. So in this study, they wanted to compare massed teaching trials to interspersed teaching trials. And for their definition, the mass trials meant that all the trials that they ran for the week were consolidated into one day. And for the ITT, they ran trials across the week. So they had done this previously with a group of children without a diagnosis, and they wanted to see, did they get the same results for children with an autism diagnosis? So that was the population here. The dependent variable that they were looking at was correct unprompted responses, and they taught something specific for each participant that they had. There were 3 participants in the study. Gary was 4. He spoke in full sentences.
Go, Gary.
Mike was 5. He spoke in full sentences at home, but not at school.
Go, Mike. I feel you.
There was a story there that didn't get told.
Yeah.
Abby was 10, and she also spoke in full sentences. So for both of the 2 conditions that they were looking at, there were 80 trials that were presented during the week. For Gary, they presented 80 trials of interverbal WH questions. So there were 5 stimuli that he was learning. For Mike, the way that they listed it, this is in quotes, was listener responses to textual stimuli is what they were teaching him, which I deciphered to mean he was identifying written words.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay. So
that makes sense. I would decipher that as well.
it just took me a minute. So there were 10 stimuli for him. And then for Abby, she was reading sight words. And there were 10 stimuli for her. So each of them got 80 presentations of either the 5 or the 10 stimuli, 80 total trials per week. Okay. So for the mass trials, they just did all 80 of them in a row during one day. And for the ITT, they did 20 trials per day. So it was 4 days of the week. They noted it was non-consecutive. So there was like one school day where they didn't come to school or they didn't do it. They used a constant prompt delay for all of them. And for correct unprompted responses before or after the error correction.
Oh.
Just noteworthy right there,
Yeah,
right?
that
Because I
is
don't
important.
typically reinforce after error correction. So before or after any unprompted response that was correct was reinforced with praise each time and with a token every 4 times on an FR4 schedule. And then when they had 5 tokens, they could trade in for 2 minutes with an iPad, which is apparently the universal reinforcer.
We're just going to move it into the primary reinforcer category, I think.
Yeah.
We're all born. We need food. We need shelter, water, and iPad.
An iPad.
That's how we're
That's
born
all you
now.
need. Yep. So the mastery criterion was 90% correct unprompted responses across 2 consecutive sessions. And the design for this study was an adapted alternating treatments design. Okay? Who can tell me why it was an adapted alternating treatments design? I'm going to tell you because it can't be just a straight up alternating treatments design because there are different stimuli present in the different conditions, right?
Great.
Oh.
Yeah.
I didn't even think of
Yes. Yes. Because if they had used the same stimuli in each condition, then the study would be null and void because you wouldn't know which of the conditions produced
Obviously.
acquisition.
Okay.
We knew that. We
Right.
just wanted to make you feel better
I
about
know.
it.
That's why I thought that we should review.
Yeah.
So if you are trying to do an alternating treatments design for a skill acquisition, you need to separate it out in that way. So that is what makes it the adapted alternating treatments design. Bring
that. That's great.
the more you know.
Wow.
Okay, so they did a baseline in which there was no reinforced responding or prompting. Then they divvied it up and had some stimuli become the mass trial stimuli and some stimuli become the distributed practice stimuli. And then they taught those on each of those schedules that I mentioned. And then there was also a control group of stimuli that they presented one day a week. Oh, that was probably the day that they didn't run the other one.
Yep.
It's all coming together now.
Mhm.
So that those never got, were never taught.
You're
and they
so
were never-
smart with understanding your adapted alternate treatments, but forgot the fact there were 5 days in a week.
That sounds 100% like me, doesn't it? Okay. So I'm ready for results. The results were that no one mastered the stimuli in the control condition. But that was not a surprise. Additionally, however, no one mastered the stimuli in the masked trials condition.
This is going to be a big
Whoa.
difference.
Maybe was a little bit of a surprise.
Yeah.
That is definitely a
okay.
surprise.
I think the authors were like, "Oh no, we're never
They're like,
finishing."
what? No. These were the similar results to what they found in their previous study.
I know, but
So,
Right.
It's another Kodak study. So, Gary ran 500 trials of the masked trials. Mike ran 360 trials, and Abby ran 320 trials, and they never reached mastery criterion for any of them after that period of time. Okay. However, the stimuli that were presented in the distributed trials condition were mastered for all 3 participants. Gary, it only took 80 trials. Mike took 220 and Abby took 140.
those are still a lot. It's like a little.
not
I mean,
five.
that's
500.
80 per week.
I know it's
right?
like a little a lot.
Well, not really. I mean, even Mike, it was 220 trials. That's only 3 weeks.
It just seems like a lot.
It does, but when you say it that way,
When you say
Not
200,
really.
it sounds like a
But
lot
when you're
you say...
right, but when you have to do other things, it's still a lot. I don't know. I think it's still a lot, but it's
I think
not.
that many students work on things for way longer than 3 weeks.
Oh, I agree. I think it's a little a lot. That's why I say that.
They might have learned 1,000 other stimuli. It's just these seem to be the hardest ones for some reason. We don't know.
sure.
Okay. But this was big news, right? And they had a bar graph and everything to show us the difference between the number of trials for the masked and the interspersed. And the bar for the masked trials was much bigger because it took much longer to not master them than it did for the interspersed trials. Okay? So they said, could this be related to the reinforcement schedule? They only gave a token every 4 trials. Maybe, but probably not because it was the same across the 2 conditions. So they didn't think that that was that important. They said, is it possible that there was a change in the motivating operations given that the mass trials, they had to run 80 trials in a row? Ding, ding, ding. That seems a little bit more likely to me, right? Or they said, did something funky happen with the error correction procedure? Were there a different number of errors across the 2 trials? They needed to do more research to figure out if that was important or not. Okay. So that's the story. Turns out, trying to run 80 trials in a day of one stimulus, your student either finds that aversive, checks out, or in some other manner does not learn under those conditions.
So my question when I read this study is, why did they choose to define masked trials in this very specific way when we read 2 other articles discussing masked trials, which pretty much was just what the Hack article calls distributed trials? You know, it's like 20 or 10 or 15. You know, the numbers varied.
I don't know.
Why? And you even put this in the notes. Who does this? Who was like, I want to run everything one day a week, 100 times, and then it's not like cleaning your room where it's like, I'll just do it all on Monday and then I don't have to clean my room the rest of the week. It's, we're just going to do these 80 times now and then whoosh,
And then you're done.
we're not going to do this again for a week.
Right.
That's strange.
I was a little bit surprised as well. I'm not sure why they set it up this way because it isn't typically how we teach in an ABA designed classroom, let's say. And it's also not typically how students are taught in the general education classroom, at least in low grades, right? You revisit material often during like the course of a week usually.
Sure.
So you have multiple opportunities to practice and maintain previously acquired skills.
And they had, how many, it was 3 targets per kid?
No, between 5 and 10.
Oh, it's 5 and 10 targets per kid.
Yeah.
In that regard, it would be a bit more like what you might see, you know, in a math class where you have like a page and there's, you know, 40 problems maybe or 30 problems. Usually not that many, but some number of problems. But then they're doing that every day and then they're presenting the tasks in different ways throughout. So I don't even think you're right. It has a kind of a direct corollary to what you might see in a general ed classroom or during like a whole group instruction setting.
Yeah, so I mean, they found a really clear answer to a question, But I don't know if it's the question that everyone's asking with regard to mass versus
Or what we're asking.
distributed trials.
What we're asking and what we've found in the research.
Yeah,
Right?
It's a different question.
Yeah.
If you're thinking of starting a school in which you learn one thing per day for a lot of day, please write in. Let us know why you're thinking that. And I guess this research might be relevant to you. Or in the less flip response, if this is something that you've done in places you worked, or if this is a format or a protocol that you have seen run and that there is a distinct reason for
Benefit.
that. Yeah.
Right? Or advantage.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because we don't know.
Well, there certainly have been times when I've, looked at a client's, whole system and said, we're not running this enough. There's just not enough opportunity.
If only we could just run it one day a week. All day.
Well, the idea is we're gonna focus on it. We're gonna drill down. We're gonna practice this a whole bunch, right? And it's gonna stick. You can see how the reasoning could happen in that way, but at least for these 3 participants, that was not an effective way to learn.
No. Okay. All right. Well, let's switch gears to an article that discusses masked trials in a little bit of a different way, shall we? I'm going to talk about the Majdalani et al. Study. So, again, just to recenter you, we are not defining mass trials and distributed trials the same way in this article, which makes the titles confusing when you're trying to sort of directly compare the articles. So, in this case, mass trials were defined in which you have one exemplar or program, so you could have multiple targets within that program, taught at a time, in which there is nothing interspersed between the different presentations of the stimuli, and there is a very short ITI. So we're not talking about necessarily 80 of these types of instructions in a row, but we are talking about the presentation very quickly of a number of different targets. Distributed trials here is defined in which there are long breaks between exemplars. Again, we're not talking about days. We're talking about 10 seconds to several minutes, which, again, 10 seconds in distributed trials, I wonder if I would call that distributed trials in the practice I've done. So certainly, if we've all worked with staff members who you're watching them and one of the things for feedback, you're like, the ITI needs to be a lot shorter than it is. Like you're checking your phone in between trials, probably a bit of a distraction. So, you want to cut that down a little bit. But I would still consider it to be more masked trials than distributed trials in those regards. However, in this article, that chunk of time, there's some time in between touch blue. Oh, you're still here. How about red?
Oh, you're still here. I like that.
And then finally, task interspersal, which was not featured in the last article. This is what I think we all would expect it to be, in which we're interspersing previously mastered tasks with the original acquisition tasks. Mm-hmm. So it's pretty similar to mass trials in the regards of short ITI. The difference is that I'm going from, my 3 targets, and in between I'm throwing in other mastered stimuli.
Or non-mastered stimuli. So
one could. In this article, it was mastered.
Right. One could do both.
Yes.
One could.
You could do that. But
yes.
In this article, it's specifically mastered tasks.
Okay. Good to know.
But that is a good point, Aggie. You could do whatever you want and call it interspersal in between.
Right.
But in this article, it's going to be talking about mastered tasks. So
just wanted to be clear because I know somebody was driving in their car right there and be like, no, you can do it this way too, Rob. And then you're like, no, you have to read the article. Person driving.
I'm not going to be so condescending to someone who's going to the trouble of talking to me in their car when I'm not there.
But you are there, Rob.
I am there in spirit. So the Majdalani article refers to a study by Volkert et al. And colleagues in 2008, which had done a similar study in which they compared masked and task interspersal trial types and had found that masked trials had been superior. The extension here is, well, what if we throw in another trial type? We got distributed now, which is fair. I think it's always fun to have, more trial types when you can, right? The researchers had 6 participants, all children with autism. They were all able to tact at least 100 pictures and could vocally respond to questions. They referred to them as level 2 learners on a VB-MAP assessment, which I assume meant they also did all the other things required of them to score level 2 on a VB-MAP assessment rather than just those 2, in which case it would be a stretch to say that they're solidly level 2 VB-MAP learners. All of the participants, except for one, could speak in 3 to 4 word phrases. Alex could speak in 6 to 8 word phrases, and this will come up again later. I didn't just say this because I forgot and wrote it in my notes. I swear it's important. The participants were between the ages 4 and 5 and had a diagnosis of ASD or Asperger's syndrome or PDD-NOS. So this was a multiple baseline across participants with an alternating treatment component hidden inside, with a dependent variable being, simply what is the percentage of independent correct responses? And the fun task they picked, because you always get to do a fun task when you're trying to teach something novel as part of a research study, was tax of paper cutouts of countries. Which again, if you're new to research, you'll say, why would you ever bother teaching that? You got to find something the students probably won't see 50,000 times during their normal day, which is going to be a huge confound there. So we had tax of paper country cutouts.
I have that in my room.
What, paper country cutouts?
Yep.
So
Why?
Jackie would be a giant confound in this study.
I don't, but it would be awesome if I did.
I guess.
Well, then I would know all the countries, right?
I guess you could. You could sing the Animaniacs song.
Yeah.
Remember the Animaniacs? Did you know that one?
It's coming back. Yeah.
The Animaniacs song where they do all the countries? There's an updated version too with the same voice actor. He added all the new countries that had come into being since
good.
what was it, mid 90s, I think, when that song came out.
I do know that reference. It's a cartoon.
It is. So the researchers took 20 different countries and broke them up into groups of 5 countries that were matched for the number of syllables, which I thought was a nice little extra detail. We had our 3 trial types. And you might say, well, what was the 4th one? They also had an extended baseline because, again, you're comparing your 3 trial types. You probably also want to compare it to, and then we did nothing to make sure that these kids just didn't somehow magically learn country cutout names out of the blue. There was also the second dependent variable, which was just how long did it take to teach all of these targets to mastery? And that was defined as the total time between the first teaching trial of whichever intervention phase, distributed, masked, or interspersed, to the last teaching trial in which mastery, which was 80% correct responding across 2 consecutive sessions. So the procedure was pretty much the same other than, which trial type was being used, in that there'd be 20 trials for every session. So no matter which trial type they were using, you got 20 tries at it. Very different than the previous study because they were all comparatively were going to be close to the same amount of time, at least in terms of overall time. They couldn't be too different from each other. So you've got 5 countries. They were each presented 4 times. There was a 1-minute break between each condition. And in between that time, the students had access to a preferred item. So the baseline condition was pretty much what you'd expect. I hold up my paper cutout, say, what country is it? And then no matter what the student says, I wait for 5 seconds. And then I continue on. If they say something and it's right, say something and it's wrong, they don't say anything at all, just keep going. That's our baseline. When a teaching component was added in, they also included social praise on an FR1 schedule. And they used immediate prompts to start until the participant said the response at the same time as that prompt, 3 consecutive trials. And then they would use a progressive prompt delay. They'd move to 1 second delay, then a 3-second delay, then a 5-second delay. They also didn't use any error correction procedure. I know that can come up because, some folks I know have a very stringent error correction procedure they like to use. Some don't use any at all. In this case, they just said, no, it's Uruguay, or, whatever the correct answer was. And then they moved on. So when the researchers were using their masked trials, again, it was going to be 20 trials. They taught 5 countries, just like in every other condition, presented 4 times each, kind of randomly distributed. And they would just present them. They'd use those prompts. They'd wait, 1 to 2 seconds with 1 to 2 second ITI. They'd give social praise if they got the right answer. And then they moved on to the next trial. 1 to 2 seconds, moved on. 1 to 2 seconds, moved on. And that was it. For the distributed trials, they scheduled 10 seconds between each country presentation. Again, nothing was happening in between there. They didn't add extra praise. They gave the praise if the student was right, and then waited 10 seconds. Which, man, have you waited 10 seconds? I'm going to do it right now. Here we go. Ready?
This is a long time.
That wasn't even 10 seconds, and you were getting frustrated. So that was going to be the most boring of the trials, I would guess. So that's the distributed trials. Again, just 20 trials. And then the task interspersal, in which they would present a country, and then in that 10 seconds in between trials of the acquisition, the target acquisitions, they would present 3 previously mastered targets. And they were also taxed. They just had 20 different tasks that the student had already mastered, and they'd present them. So what is it? Uruguay. What is it? It's a pencil. What is it? It's a duck. What is it? It's a, box of juice, whatever it is. And they'd randomly intersperse those 20 in there. So again, same amount of time, 10 seconds. They just the kids had something to do in between. All right. They also did some follow-up sessions. So once everything was mastered, they would do a follow-up session 1 week later, 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later with the same stimuli to see to the students so the participants still remember these countries. Let's talk results. And because
can't wait.
because I think it's relevant, and it'll be relevant sort of in talking about your article too, Jackie. I'm just going to go student by student. We don't always do that, but I think it is important for this topic. So we've got Sal. He reached mastery fastest with the MAST trials. And this is different for him than for many other of the participants. He never met mastery using the interspersal style of teaching or the distributed trial style of teaching. Eventually, they just used MAST trials for everything because it was taking forever.
So for him, we know what you should use.
Yes.
Done.
So if you're working with Sal, you should use MAST trial, at least with tax. And again, the only skill he maintained on 1, 2, and 3 week follow-ups was, with the MAST trial teaching format, because those are the only ones he ever actually acquired.
At least he maintained them, though.
He did maintain them.
That's great.
So let's move on to Alex. And if you will remember, Alex was our participant who spoke 6 to 8 words per sentence. So he had many more words per sentence than the other participants. He learned his targets using the distributed trial instruction the fastest. He also showed the best maintenance. So the highest independent correct responding 1 and 2 and 3 weeks later with the targets he learned during his distributed instruction. He will be the only one who learns with that pattern. Herbert and Adam and Mike and Nate learned their targets fastest in the MAST trial instructional format. However, for Herbert, he actually maintained the most targets that he learned using task interspersal. Adam, much like Sal, also had the best maintenance with the targets he learned in the MAST trial format. Mike, again, MAST trial was the quickest way for him to learn his targets. However, his best maintenance was both targets taught in distributed trials and task interspersal, but not MAST trials.
Yeah.
And then
That's
with
a
Nate,
hard one. Isn't that a hard one?
Which one?
It's a hard one when
When it's all over the results are all over the place?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's just hard. It's
Yeah.
hard.
And then Nate, MAST trials was the quickest way for him to learn. However, targets taught with distributed trials were the ones that he maintained the best. Now let's talk a little bit about the mean time it took between all of these training trials. MAST trials, as you would guess, took the shortest amount of time. It was an average session length of about 2 minutes. It was 1 minute 55 seconds with a range of 1 minute 25 to 2 minutes 38 seconds. Task interspersal and distributed were both longer than that and were about the same. They were about 5 minutes per session length. It was 4 minutes 55 seconds for task interspersal and 4 minutes 58 seconds for the distributed trials. And they ranged from about 4 minutes, a little over 4 minutes 30 seconds to about almost 7 minutes, 30 seconds in terms of total length of time.
That is a lot longer.
Oh, yeah.
A lot longer.
It's a lot longer. A lot longer.
We should wait for 3 minutes in silence. And
Yeah, that would be fun. People will think their podcast player broke.
Yeah.
Is it broken?
It's broken.
We also, when we talk about how the different trial types led to, quicker mastery, that was also different. So certainly for someone like Sal, it was hundreds and hundreds of trials, and he may never have learned using the distributed trials or the task interspersal trials. But for some of the other participants, it was pretty variable. So for example, like Nate took 50 to 70 more sessions before he reached mastery using the non-MAST trial formats. Adam is only 20 more, so it really was varied. And so if I said, it's going to take me 20 more trials to learn during this format, but don't worry, the maintenance is consistently better,
I'd be okay with that.
I wouldn't really care about the difference. I'd say,
Yeah.
well, pick the one with the better maintenance. That's important long term. But what I'm saying, it's probably going to take like 70 to 80 trials more. But the maintenance, sometimes is better. Again, okay, that's not quite as good of a sell. Not necessarily bad, but not quite as good of a sell. So the overall results, 5 out of 6 students learned the fastest. So learning was most efficient using the MAST trial format. However, best maintenance was really all over the place. There wasn't one consistent format that worked best for all students. There's also the question then of, how come Alex did better with distributed trials and only Alex? And that brings us back to something we mentioned at the top of the show.
The Alex phenomenon.
From Sundberg. I know, I love Alex Mack. From Sundberg, he recommends in the VB-MAP protocol that teaching trials that are embedded throughout the day can often be a faster way to teach for students who have more advanced language. So was Alex's difference in terms of, utterances per sentence? Was that demonstrating that he is an advanced learner compared to the other participants? Therefore, we'd expect distributed trials to always work better. And it's one of those things of you can't say for sure. It might have just been a total fluke. But these are the research areas and the research questions that come up from this.
So when I think about this line of research, I think it's important for new behavior analysts to read this research because there is no answer. And so I think a lot of people that pass the exam are like, I know everything. I'm going to be the best behavior analyst ever. I know I thought that, but you don't know the answers. And even people that are doing the research still don't know the answers, right? So, and this is like a really hard question, right? Like it really could make like a life and learning decision, right? Like you could be spending a long time teaching something that then never maintains. So what's the point?
Yeah.
Or you're taking a long time teaching something that may maintain, but you wasted a lot of time teaching other things, right? So it's like it's hard because you don't know when you start off, right? So it's kind of like a guess.
Yep.
In a way, right?
It's very true.
And there's not an assessment that I know of that you can just quickly pop up. Like, can't do preference assessment for like mass trials versus interspersed trials. Although
you could, but would it actually tell you
Right.
what you
want to
the answer
know.
to the question? Yeah.
Would it decrease problem behavior?
Yeah.
Would it increase learning?
Is this the most efficient? Just
Right?
because someone prefers this trial. I love interspersal. It takes me 1,000 trials to learn any targets, and I
But
don't
I
maintain
love
anything,
it.
but it happens to be my favorite
So
for some reason.
Yeah, so that's something that while I was reading these articles and, we had mixed results across all of them, right? So we don't have a consistent answer to tell you is that we still don't know a lot.
We don't. And I want you to
Right?
hold that thought, and I want you, the listeners, to hold that thought. We're going to take a quick break, and then we're going to come back with our last article of the episode. Hold your horses. We'll be right back.
Do you want to be a BCBA?
Sure, we all do.
Now you can come to Regis College in Weston, Mass. to get your graduate degree.
Choose from any one of these courses.
Masters of Science in Applied Behavior Analysis.
Masters of Science in Special Education.
Dual degree in Special Ed and ABA.
Or be eligible for your postmaster's certificate.
You can complete your degree and be ready to sit for the exam in 2 years. And our 2017 grads had a 100% pass rate on the BACB exam.
Come enjoy practicum placement support, ethics mini handbooks, PhD level professors, small class sizes, and a service trip to Iceland.
If interested, don't delay. Supplies are limited. Learn more at regiscollege.edu.
Again, that's www.regiscollege.edu, regiscollege.edu. One more time, www.regiscollege.edu. See you there!
And we are back, grappling with the important question of the episode: mass trials, the best trials or the worst trials? Number 2 will surprise you. All right, let's get back.
Click!
I love clickbait jokes. They're my favorites.
When I hate it when I get caught into the clickbait and it's like the slideshow and you're like, you haven't given me the answer. And then they never do. Mm-hmm. This happened with one of them recently where it was Robert Redford's daughter's the beautifulest thing you'll ever see. And I was like, I want to see. Mm-hmm. It was just Robert Redford's career. I mean, yeah, there was like a picture of her when she was like a young child, but like that was it. I didn't go all the way to the end, so maybe it was at the end, but I was like, I don't need to know this all.
Yeah.
But yeah.
No.
But this we're actually
Really
going to tell
sucks
you.
in.
It did.
We're going to tell you what we can tell you. Unfortunately, not going to have the final answer.
Right.
But before we get to that final answer, I do want to remind all of our listeners that ABA Inside Track is ACE approved. By listening to our show, you are able to earn a one learning credit. They're A1 steak sauce credits. Learning credits.
Learning credit.
All you need to do is listen to the full episode and go to our website, abainsidetrack.com/get-CEUS, get CEUs. And you're going to need to enter in some information, including 2 secret code words that we've hidden in the episode. I'm going to give you the first one right now. It's BLUE. BLUE.
Or if you're French, BLEU.
I mean, that's going to get really
Bleh.
complicated. I was
I'm
also
just
going to say,
kidding. Bleh.
if you also include the lyrics to the song Bare Necessities, we would accept the code word BALOO, BALOO. But it's none of those, and we've confused all our listeners. It's blue, the color, BLUE, the color of Smurfs and the sky on a sunny day.
Nice.
And Cookie Monster.
And a Cookie Monster. Blue. All right. So, Jackie, we teased everyone before we went on break that we were going to talk about the last article, and then we're going to come back around with some final thoughts.
Yeah.
So, why don't you take the mic?
I've taken the mic and I've held it in my hand. And I am going to give you a little summary of the Hendrickson and colleagues article, Teaching with Massed versus Interspersed Trials, Effects on Acquisition, Maintenance, and Problem Behavior. I love titles that tell you exactly what you're going to learn and nothing else. It's very to the point. And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to look at whether massed trials versus interspersed trials have any difference in effectiveness, efficiency, and if there's any effect on problem behavior. And they define interspersed trials as a 3-to-1 ratio. So 3 mastered to 1 non-mastered. So that's what they're using. That's different. But
Well, that's the same as in the Magellani.
Yep.
3-to-1. So we got at least one similar.
right. But they
Exact same.
Yeah, the exact same.
The exact same.
But they do make the point that interspersed is just mixing acquisition and non-acquisition targets. So it could be either a mastered target or it could be a non-mastered target. And they said that usually, even though there isn't a set ratio, someone usually picks a ratio. It's usually like 1-to-3 or 5-to-2. They chose the 1-to-3.
Depends on if someone with a big ratio got to them.
Right? And one thing I do love here is they talk a little bit more in depth about interspersed trials than previous articles do. And they kind of give us the rationale on why they're looking at this one, because there is mixed results in the literature. And they're looking at whether interspersed can decrease problem behavior, or if there's a variation in demands, will students be more motivated to engage in the task? So that's one of the reasons why they wanted to look at this interspersed trial over mass trial. But few studies have looked at the maintenance and the efficacy between the two specifically. That's why they wanted to look at this. And I love that they're looking at problem behavior too. So on page 38, they say the following study compared the effects of MTT and ITT on the acquisition of various training programs. They had 3 for 3 children with ASD. For each method, we evaluated the number of sessions to criterion, the rate of acquisition, and the percentage of trials per session with problem behavior.
That's probably the biggest addition to in this article versus the Magellani article.
Yep, and then they also looked at maintenance to see what happened there. So again, they had 3 boys with ASD ranging in age from 5 to 7 years old with varying repertoire. So I like this. Some spoke in full sentences, some used picture communication, and they either or did not have an imitative repertoire. So they didn't choose like people that would do really well, they thought, or would not do well. They kind of used the gamut. So that was one thing that I found noteworthy in this study. Sessions occurred in a pull-out room with teaching materials and preferred items. They did do a preference assessment prior to each session, which I loved.
I like
Free
that
operant. Yeah.
I don't want the same thing every day.
I do, but
That's why we're different people.
yeah, so the maintenance targets were previously mastered, and the acquisition targets had never previously been taught in their program. I love that they specified that.
We swear.
We swear, we've
didn't do
never
this
taught
already.
them. We looked back in many, many years. We never saw them in the books. So the number of sessions to achieve mastery was 90% across 2 consecutive sessions, and their IOA was 90% or higher. They were very specific about which IOA method they used for which DV, which I also appreciated. Because sometimes people are like, we conducted IOA and this is what it was. But they're like, we conducted IOA in this way for this DV and this way for this DV. So I like that.
The section on IOA is typically the paragraph I gloss over because I'm saying, if it was really terrible, I would assume this wouldn't have been published. So,
Not always, but you're right.
I mean, I look for my numbers. I'm like, am I saying like 80s and 90s? In which case, I'm probably
Yeah.
good.
So they used a non-concurrent multiple baseline design across participants with embedded modified alternating treatments design. So that's what they call it. They called it a modified, not an adapted. But same thing. You know, so they had 3 programs, and the programs were the same across MTT and ITT. So they said that they chose an acquisition target of the same verbal operant. So the first program was looking at receptive identification of adjectives. The second program was looking at teaching function of objects or tacting pictures depending on the participant. And the third program was either matching, sorting, or receptive identification of prepositions depending on the repertoire of the participant. So that was nice. They were very specific about what they were doing in a table. And I love it when people put in a table so that I don't have to read through it. I can just glance at the table and move on in my life. So we all
I love
like
it when
that.
they manage to fit multiple purposes into one table.
Yes.
That's really my favorite.
Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, so the table actually helped, though, because they said the acquisition targets were similar and within the verbal operants, and that confused me a little bit. I'm like, what exactly are they talking about?
Yeah.
But they highlighted it saying, so what is this would be all together, and solve the mouth problem would be all together. So they just had similar instructions. So that helped a little bit when I looked at the table. But when I read
the target response was of a similar.
Of the same, yeah. So that helped. But when I read that the first time, I was like, are they all manding?
Right.
Like I got,
yeah.
It's like, is that an echoic? But they didn't specify that specifically, but, you know, they were very similar. And no program consequences were provided during the pre-assessment. Only one target was presented each day. And then they ran baseline. Seems silly that they did a pre-assessment and a baseline. They should have just used the baseline as the pre-assessment, but that's okay. So with the baseline, they presented both acquisition targets counterbalanced between the MTT and ITT trials. They had 10 trials for each acquisition target, and the trial was over after 5 seconds following the SD. So if the student responded, yay. If they didn't, they moved on. They had no program consequences during baseline. So for treatment, they did that free operant preference assessment for one participant and an MSWO for all 3 participants. They used the top 2 highly preferred tangibles or edibles for each session. The mass trial looked the exact same as baseline, except they had the addition of non-contingent reinforcement provided prior to each acquisition trial. This was actually, I think, genius because they're trying to match the amount of reinforcement from the mass trial to the interspersed trial. So they just provided praise, like, I like your shirt today. Nice job sitting. Looking good. Before they ran the trial. So it mimicked the reinforcement provided for the interspersed.
That's really smart.
Clever addition. When I read that, I was like, why would they do that?
Yeah.
But then I got it. So each trial started after delivery of the preferred item, contingent on correct responding or error correction, and they videotaped the sessions to record the total duration, which I'm glad they put in there. And the interspersed was the exact same, except they interspersed the trials with mastered and non-mastered. The non-mastered was the acquisition. So it was 3-1. And so they had 6 different maintenance targets. They presented them 5 times each. Following maintenance, there was praise. Following acquisition was the preferred item. So you see that matched the just random 3 praise statements that they gave prior to the acquisition. They only took data on the acquisition targets. And they terminated the session if there was 10 sessions with no trend. So that's also important to note too, right? And they did that because previous research said that there was mixed results on IT.
Might not happen.
Right. And then they just did a maintenance assessment, which was the same as baseline at 2, 4, and 6 weeks for follow-up.
So
They were
longer than the
planning
previous.
ahead. Planning
This is a
ahead.
very well planned
right?
out study.
Yeah, they were planning ahead. Yeah. So now we're here. We're here at the results section. And so they looked at, in the first lovely graph that they had, was the percentage of unprompted correct responses for the program 1. And what they found here for program 1 is that participants acquired targets during the MTT in fewer sessions, but did not maintain at any during the follow-up sessions. So kind of like yours, but a little bit sadder, right? Figure 2 looks at program 2. And interesting, they acquired the targets during the ITT session here in fewer sessions. And 1 participant maintained during the 2 and 4 week. And 2 participants only maintained during the 6 week. So I'm not sure what happened in 2 and 4.
It just spontaneously reappeared in their mind file, I guess.
Right.
That is an interesting finding.
Yeah. In figure 3, they saw 2 of the participants acquired targets during MTT in fewer sessions. James never acquired, so needed a DOR, differential observing response, to acquire the targets. So what they found that was interesting is that problem behavior actually occurred the same across both conditions for all participants, whereas it was similar levels as in baseline. So it didn't matter how you were presenting your targets. they were going to engage in problem behavior or not. Because one student didn't engage in problem behavior throughout the entire study, but never did.
So even though you've got the shorter trials with the mass trials, you got the less teaching time for mass trials, it didn't seem to differentiate how much problem behavior they're having. Similarly, having lots of reinforcement delivered for the different tasks didn't seem to have any effect either.
Yeah. So what they kind of tried to give us a take-home message.
They're just like, big shrug.
They're like, I don't know, but maybe we saw overall fewer sessions in MTT sessions, so that gives us less teaching time, but we didn't see maintenance. So what's more important here, teaching time or maintenance, right?
But you also didn't see very clear maintenance patterns either. It wasn't all participants. And then even when there was maintenance, it really it wasn't a matter of, we got it. Like, they might keep it a little longer and then maybe lose it later, so much as some keep it for a little while. One kid just randomly decided to remember everything somehow. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know what happened there.
Very odd.
Yeah, but they did say that one of the limitations was that praise may not have served as a reinforcer for one of the participants would be, and that's kind of a huge limitation, right?
It did not reinforce the response.
Right, if you're using praise as a reinforcer. But because they used praise across both conditions, maybe it's like not that big of a deal for this study. But yeah, I could see that as a potential sadness for them. And they did have fairly lengthy sessions due to the interspersed and greater intertrial intervals between those. So they really think that future research should investigate how that can change and how maybe you can reduce the ITI, because that could have led to less learning, right? And the lengthy session could have reduced motivation or, attention to other things. We've all been there when things are going long and we're like, when is this going to be over? So yeah, but their take-home point is that the MTT may be more efficient, but we have to be careful because we have to always consider maintenance.
Yeah. Speaking of things going along that people might be saying, when is this going to be over? Let's move into dissemination station, shall we? So this is the part of the show where we sort of sum up the research that we have been discussing, and we try to, some episodes better than others, give you a nice take-home point. If you're only going to remember one thing, remember this for your practice. This is not going to be one of those episodes because there is not just a one thing that if you remember it, it will totally improve your practice, because there's a good chance that depending on which one thing we tell you, it will have absolutely no effect on some of the learners you work with. I do want to say the one thing that if you're going to pick one thing, it's think about what you have done in your practice and ask yourself every now and again, why do I do it that way? And if the answer is, I don't know, because someone told me that was the way to do it, maybe it's time to do a dive into the research yourself and get some meaningful answers, primary sources rather than the secondary sources of, say, a professor or a textbook.
Yeah, and it might also be helpful, even though we don't really have the research to prove it, but we might have some speculation, is when you're looking at the research, find participants that are like the participant you are working with, like your client, right? So maybe look for, if you have a client who engages in, lengthy verbal phrases, maybe look for those participants when you're looking at the research.
Yeah.
Maybe, I don't know, but I think it'll give you hopefully a more
probably a stronger place to at least start
from.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that there may be some sort of postmarks to guide you toward either MTT or ITT, depending on your client profile. So if you have a client, like you're saying, Jackie, that is more highly verbal, then maybe ITT might be a good strategy for them. If you have a client that seems to engage in more challenging behavior during demand sessions, then maybe ITT might be better for them.
But maybe not, though.
But maybe not.
They didn't actually get that. That was not the result that came out in at least the study we reviewed.
I guess so. But if you think back to our discussion of CMORs, then this could be one of the strategies that you might use.
Yes.
As well, that Carbone article. But then again, if you have a client that seems like they might really benefit from repetition and more opportunities to respond in a single session, then maybe MTT might be better for them. But to my knowledge, no one has kind of gone through and made a flowchart of this. So might be a nice research opportunity out there. But the results right now are so idiosyncratic and mixed that no one's for sure whether one or other of these methods might be better.
Right.
I think my initial point was maybe we shouldn't always think of MTT as our default status, right? And there may be some additional benefits to ITT that just haven't been uncovered because we're looking at such small samples across really scattered procedural variations here and definitional variations on what ITT actually means. So to me, a lot more research could be done in this area, but very likely the results are going to end up being it's idiosyncratic for your students, and there's going to be some indicators as to when this might be a preferred method or not. Another thing we haven't discussed yet is that I did a lot of ITT for my very young clients, my under 3 clients, and we would intersperse different acquisition and or maintenance trials together. And this often was related to helping to shape their attending behavior at the table, right? Or on the floor, because we would intersperse different types of trials during that time period such that they could work a little bit on imitation and then a little bit on doing a puzzle together, right? And then a little bit on eye contact or whatever it might be. And that was a strategy that I kind of inherited in that program, but I found to work well with many of the clients there. And I would encourage you to think about these variations here with whatever population you're working with. Even though there's not hard and fast research on it, there might be additional strategies to try when you're thinking about how to best work with an individual client.
Right. And I think it also might be cool to do research on using both. Right. So maybe for new acquisition, you do some mass trials, but then once they get like 50% or something, then you move to ITI.
Yeah.
Right. So then you're getting the best of both worlds, right? You're kind of laying a solid foundation of, correct responding with a lot of practice, but then interspersing so that you're making sure that they're actually attending to the relevant cues, and you're using those maintenance targets potentially, right, as practice too, right? Because we want those to still maintain and receive reinforcement.
So here's the thing: when we're talking about the interspersal in the articles today, we're talking about interspersal with, in these cases, it was all mastered tasks of the same topography, or they were the same verbal operants. What we never talked about, and would be, I think, important to talk about, would be what if our interspersed targets were different operants or completely different topographies of class. Like you were saying, Diana, some imitation versus the tact training that you're sort of working on at the time. You do some object imitation. You can do some sort of joint responding, like do some joint attention type respond. You could intersperse all sorts of trials in between your acquisition program.
Yeah.
And what effect, if any, would that have? Would that then sort of more closely meet, I think, the definition of the distributed trial at that point? Because you're potentially having these lengthier periods in between the presentation of the acquisition programs.
That's a great question. And
I thank you.
I don't know the answer. I will say I did some research on this a little while back, and what we found, they were different trial types that we were attempting to intersperse. So it might be like 10 trials. So we'll do 5 of each of these different types of programs. And what I found is that very often the 2 different programs that we were attempting, so we do like 2 different things, one of them 5 in a row and then 5 of the next one as the mast, and then the other 10 interspersed together as the interspersed. And what I found a few different times is that the 2 different things that we had selected were not yoked in difficulty, right? So then what ended up happening is whichever one of them was easier, we saw acquisition in that in both the mast and the interspersed. So it wasn't the trial type or presentation that was determining acquisition. It was the task difficulty. So I think that could be really challenging to try to get that equal, because you almost don't know if they are going to be equal until you've taught them, right? But I suspect if when we're smart enough, they could think of a way around that problem. And I am very interested in answering that question.
And when you look at like imitative research too, and they look like, will those operants emerge if you teach multiple operants? And the answer is no most of the time. So I wonder if that kind of line of research will, bring it in, or does it not matter, but it's just listening to the instruction, right? And following the prompt. I don't know.
So I guess until we get some sort of a preference assessment-esque technology for choosing trial type formats for learners, is it going to be kind of like reinforcement? You don't know it happened until you've sort of delivered it enough times and, oh, well, we use mass trials and hey, Billy learned in only 30 sessions and then maintained the skill. Therefore, mass trials might be a good one to use for similar type tasks for him. It's kind of where we are, it seems, right now, to some extent.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it makes sense why mass trials exist, right? And why they work, because they give the opportunity to respond and receive reinforcement right away. And then you build up that reinforcement history quickly. So it makes sense, certainly, that mass trials work. But there may be other limiting factors sometimes as to why they might not be, in the long term, the best decision for your individual client. And I think that has to be a determination made for each client.
And then that also gets to the point, too, of when we're talking about our follow-ups here, even when one trial type had a superior kind of follow-up performance, it's not like the student was necessarily continuing to have some amount of maintenance practice in between there. So how many students are still going to work on a skill? And then anyway, we're not going to talk about that skill, or you're not going to have to tact that for 6 weeks or so. And then you might see it. Realistically, there are certain things that we all learn that we probably won't see for a period of time afterwards. But is that the sort of, problem that could be ameliorated through just, well, make sure that, you do have some schedule of additional, booster training every now and again. And then any benefit you see with mass trials or interspersals or distributed sort of vanishes because every 2 weeks you do a 5-session booster or something. That would be the other kind of question that would be worth looking at to see is there a way to make one of these trial types better than the others more consistently with a few tweaks here or there? Does it really matter? I would say yes, it does really matter. So I guess that answers that question. But finding that answer is one that is not currently complete. Oh, well, at least there's more to think about, right?
Yeah. You guys should just really sit and think about this.
Just sit and think.
Drink some tea.
Stare into space and think. That's how you'll find the answers.
Think about it. Stare at a candle.
Try not to blink.
Yeah.
Well, that brings us to the end of our topic of mass trials versus the world. And the winner was you, the audience, we hope, at least.
The world won.
The world won.
I think mass trials won.
I think mass trials technically won. But I mean, is there sort of like a technicality win? Like, I don't know. We need a rematch.
It was like unsatisfying on all counts. Yeah.
It's like the end of Rocky. Spoiler alert for Rocky. Rocky does not win.
It's like the end of Game of Thrones.
I don't think it's like the end of Game of Thrones.
I do. Yeah.
I had a great time the whole way through this episode, unlike
Rob,
Game of Thrones.
That's fine, but I'm going to need that in writing.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Oh, well.
Expect a 5-page essay.
Before we wrap up our episode, I want to make sure to give out that second secret code word, and it is catfish. 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 It's like the fish with it's got the weird tentacle mustache. It's like on the bottom of
He's extremely handsome.
Water. You can eat it. It's delicious.
With hush puppies.
With a hush puppy. Catfish. And with that, we come to a close on our episode. We want to thank all of you so very much for listening to ABA Inside Track. We really hope you enjoyed the show. If so, please think about subscribing to the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you can leave us a review on any of those formats, please, we would love to hear from you. There are a lot of other ways we'd love to hear from you, too. Why not reach out to us through social media? We're on Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest, Instagram, all as ABA Inside Track. You can find these episodes posted on YouTube with YouTube subtitling feature. You can go to our website, abainsidetrack.com, to find a description of the episodes as well as the episodes themselves and links to the articles discussed. And of course, you can always feel free to shoot us an email at abainsidetrack@gmail.com. In addition to thanking you, the audience, we also want to thank Dr. Jim Carr for recording our intro and outro music, Kyle Sturria for our interstitial music, Daniel Thabit from the Podcast Doctors for his editing work, and Hollis Irvin from the Sycamore Workshop for our visual designs. Well, I think that's everybody. I also want to say a big thank you to Diana and Jackie, my fabulous co-hosts.
You're welcome.
I'm so glad I'm still fabulous after all these years.
After all these years.
Jackie and fabulous.
Fab.
We'll be back next week with another fun-filled episode. But until then, keep responding. Bye.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.